Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. I hope you guys are all enjoying your Thanksgiving with your loved ones. Please enjoy it, and I wish you guys a safe travels back to San Marcos for those who are traveling, maybe even out of state. But anyway, we met on Monday this week, which is on the 25th, and I introduced chapter 15, which is a chapter on monetary policy. But since some of you left town early, I promised students who showed up that day that I was going to record the full lecture for this chapter so that you get a chance, you can watch the video before our meeting next Monday. So treat this video as if you're getting it directly from the classroom because we're not going to repeat it again. You can watch it over and over. So once I've finished recording this video, I'm going to upload it on my YouTube link, a link that I'm going to post at Canvas, which will allow you to access the video and watch the lecture recording for this chapter 15 on monetary policy. So as you know, as the semester winds down, we are now we are now digging deeper into the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve, what the Fed does to control the supply of dollars in the economy, monetary base, bank reserves, and stuff like that. So in chapter 13, I gave you guys an overview of the Federal Reserve System, the institutional setup of the Federal Reserve System, in terms of what the Federal Reserve does. So that different sub-entities of the Federal Reserve, ranging from the Federal Reserve banks, which are these 12 district branches all spread across the country, starting with the first district branch, which is the Boston Fed, the Philadelphia Fed, the New York Fed, coming down to the Midwestern, regions of the United States. So there are several branches of the Fed. Even here in Texas, we have the Dallas Fed, which is the 11th district branch. And on the West Coast, we have the San Francisco Fed. So in that chapter, you get to know what the Fed does and the different entities like the Federal Reserve banks, the Federal Open Market Committee, the Board of Governors, the role of the chair of the Federal Reserve. We talked about the Federal Advisory Council. And then we also discussed at length the independence of the Federal Reserve System. Why we talked about pros and cons, what the advantages for having an independent central bank, and arguments against people who don't like the Fed will bring issues with that they have with the Federal Reserve System. So we talked about that a lot. And then in chapter 14, it's a chapter about the money creation process. So the bulk of a lot of questions on the final exam is going to come from chapter 14 for sure. I've assigned homework number 2, so homework number 6, which was supposed to be due this past Tuesday, but I made the extension because I knew some of you are traveling for Thanksgiving. So that homework is not going to be due until Monday when you come back, which is December 2nd. Make sure you complete that homework and go over and over because the material there is critical for your final exam, for sure. You need to learn how to calculate the monetary base, learn how to calculate reserves, learn how to calculate the money multiplier, and working through like federal or the open market operations and other tools of monetary policy with the balance sheet and the equation that I showed you there. So in chapter 15, which I introduced on this past Monday, we're looking at a slightly different approach because chapter 14 we show you how monetary policy affect the balance sheets of the Federal Reserve and the balance sheet of private banks. Okay, so you know how to do monetary policy already in chapter 14 using balance sheet approach. Like for example, when we say the Federal Reserve buys bonds, $50 million bonds, you know what is going to change in the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, what is going to change on the balance sheet of the banks, and how reserves and monetary base will be affected in the banking system. So you know that already. And then we also developed an equation, a mathematical model to allow you see through that model, if the Federal Reserve buys bonds, how does that end up affecting, like, say, the size of the monetary base and money supply overall in the banking system? So we were able to derive the formula for the money multiplier. Okay, so now you have two main ways up to this point. You know how to you understand monetary policy using the balance sheet approach, and you know it to work through the mathematical model, the model of the money supply that we talked about in chapter 14. In this chapter 15, we're going to take a slightly different approach. You're going to learn how monetary policy works through supply and demand. We're going to use geometry, supply and demand for reserves in the banking system to see how changes in the Federal Reserve monetary policy will affect interest rates and other key variables that we care about. So I already introduced the chapter, but for just for courtesy, because some of you left town early, I'm just gonna quickly go through what I introduced on what on in the class on Monday. Then I'll pick the slack the rest from that side. So let me share my screen with you. Then I'll talk about it on the other side. Let's see here. Okay, so this is chapter 15, which is a chapter on monetary policy. So what I said was that the main goal of this chapter is going to examine the tools used by the Federal Reserve System to control the money supply interest rate. But we're going to work it through the what? Through using supply and demand. Okay. And you already, at this point, you already know those tools that I'm talking about, tools of the major tools of monetary policy. You already know them. They're going to be things like open market operations. They're going to be things like reserve requirement ratio, discount window policy when the Fed lends money to banks and charge a discount rate. That's going to be those tools of monetary policy. So I can list them here. So those tools are going to be things like, which you already know, the open market operations, which is buying and selling of treasury securities by the Federal Reserve, open market operations. We're going to talk about loans to financial institutions, loans to banks. It's another tool. And then, of course, the Fed uses a discount rate to control this policy here. Discount rate is the interest rate that the Fed is going to charge banks for lending to banks. And then, of course, the reserve requirement. The Fed sets a minimum reserve requirement ratio for all banks to follow. And then there's a new tool that the Fed, conventional tool that the Federal Reserve started using in the fall of 2008. The Fed started paying interest rate on reserve. So interest rate on reserve has become another conventional policy tool. Interest rate on reserves. I'm going to talk more about this new tool shortly. So those are some of the tools that we want to try to examine this chapter and see how they can affect the interest rate or the federal funds rate when the Fed changes those tools. Okay, so the learning objectives for this chapter is that I'm going to try to illustrate the market for reserves and demonstrate how changes in monetary policy can affect the federal funds rate. And then I'm also going to summarize how conventional monetary policy tools, the tools that I just listed on the first slide, like open market operation, buy and selling of treasury bonds, the lending to financial institutions, and the reserve requirement ratio and paying interest rate on reserves, how those conventional monetary policy tools are actually implemented, and the advantages and limitations of each tool. And then I'm going to explain, I'm also going to explain how key monetary policy tools that are used when do we use other monetary policy tools when conventional monetary policy tools are no longer relevant. Okay, so we're going to talk about some of the unconventional tools that the Federal Reserve implemented, especially during the financial crisis of 2007. Okay, and then we shall identify the distinctions and similarities between the monetary policy tools of the Federal Reserve System, the ones we use here. We're going to try to juxtapose that with those tools that are implemented by the European Central Bank or the ECB. Okay, so as I said to the students who showed up in class on Monday, this is a fairly technical chapter, and you got to bear with me because it's a little bit technical. To try to understand how how the control of reserves work in the through supply and demand. So to understand monetary policy, we're gonna develop a model, the market for reserves. So let me open my slide here, and then I'm gonna talk about it on the other side. I'm gonna open a slide here first and talk about okay. So the first thing I want to do here, I want to talk about a market for reserves. If you understand this market very well using supply and demand, you are going to be very brilliant knowing how the Fed actually, how monetary policy affect interest rate, like changes in open market operation, how that translate to affect like a federal fund rate, which is this interest rate which the market always follows. We hear, oh, the Fed has lowered interest rate. But how do they do it technically? That's what we're going to be talking about today. So anytime we talk about a market has got a supply side and a demand side. And the way we teach you in principles of micro and macroeconomics, the 2315, 2314, anytime you draw the market, you draw the demand curve, price always goes on the vertical axis. We are talking about the market for results. Okay. In chapter 9, I told you guys a little bit how banks lend each other results. Like if, let's say, a wealthy customer shows up in a bank, like Warren Buffett, and withdraws a large sums of money from a bank, that bank may run out the minimum reserve requirement. And because the Federal Reserve wants at every point in time banks to be keeping some minimum reserves for them to remain operational. So if a bank is running low on liquidity, Bank of America can go and borrow money from Citibank. We talked about that in chapter 9. You already know that. Or they can borrow from Capital One. They can borrow from any other bank. If they cannot find money from other banks, then the last place they go to is the Federal Reserve. That's why the central bank reserves that role as a lender of the last resort. Okay? So the first thing I want to talk about is when the banks borrow reserves from each other, the Bank of America goes and borrow money from Citibank. There's a price to that. Just like you, when you go borrow money from your bank, the price you pay is the interest rate. So the interest rate is going to be the price of reserves. Okay, the price that a bank must pay should they borrow reserves from other banks. So let's talk about interest rate here. So and in so many ways, I want you to understand there's going to be 3 interest rates that I'm going to be representing on the vertical axis. So the first interest rate that we talked about, which you also know from chapter 9, that chapter on management of financial institutions, is interest rate on reserves, which the notation can be IFF. So we know that this is the what? This is the interest rate which banks, I'm sorry, you've got to bear with me. My handwriting on this computer screen is not pretty. They look like chicken legs, but I hope you guys can bear with me. So this is the interest rate which banks charge each other when they loan each other funds. When they loan each other funds, and the funds I'm talking about is reserves. So when Bank of America goes and borrow, like say $10 billion from Citibank, and typically usually like overnight, short-term lending. So Bank of America is expected to pay back Citi maybe in 2 weeks or in 1 month, or whatever the terms is. Citibank may charge Bank of America 5% on that loan. So that's what that interest rate which Citibank is going to charge Bank of America when it lends money to Bank of America is what we call the federal funds rate. Okay. And then the second interest rate that we are going to illustrate, okay, we say it very clearly that if banks are not borrowing, if banks try to borrow from among each other and they can't find funds, then the last place they go to is the Federal Reserve. So the second interest rate is going to be what we call the discount rate, which I also talk about it in chapter 9. Okay, so what is the discount rate? So the discount rate is going to be defined as this is the what? This is the interest rate which the Federal Reserve, which the Fed, charges banks when it loans money to them. And our notation here, the notation for this interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges bank, or which we call the discount rate, we're just going to notate it as what? ID. So ID is a discount interest rate, discount rate. And as we learned from chapter 9, since banks go to the Fed as a last resort, that's why the Federal Reserve and any other central bank out there plays that critical role as a lender of the last resort. By design, the federal funds rate, okay, which the notation we say is IFF. This is the interest rate that banks borrow from, charge each other when they lend money among each other. That interest rate must always be less than the what? The discount rate. Because if borrowing from a Federal Reserve is borrowing as a last resort, that means the interest rate that the Federal Reserve charges banks, which we call the discount rate, this guy here, has to be higher than the what? The federal funds rate. That's true. And then there's another interest rate, which I'm going to introduce here. So ever since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 through an act of Congress, up to 2008, the Federal Reserve never paid interest rate on bank reserves. Remember, all banks in America, commercial banks in particular, are supposed to have an account with the Federal Reserve called a reserve account, just like me and you. When we open our account with our private banks, be it checkable deposit, saving account, or CDs, or mutual funds, banks are supposed to pay interest rate on our accounts with our deposit with them. But the Federal Reserve never did. They never paid interest rate on bank reserves with the Federal Reserve until the fall of 2008. So from the fall of 2008 up to today, the Fed started paying some small interest rate when banks deposit money with the Fed. And that interest rate is what we call interest rate on reserves. So interest rate is on bank reserves, which for the matter of notation, I'm just going to notate it as IOR. So by definition, this is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve pays on bank reserves or bank deposit. What? You can just write a bank reserve deposit with the Fed. Okay. So now, by design, I'm going to explain this how that interest rate that banks earn on their deposit with the Federal Reserve, which we're calling the interest rate on reserves, by design, that interest rate has to be lower than the federal funds rate. So that the IOR, interest rate on reserves, is always less than the federal funds rate. And I want you to understand it in this context. Bank of America and other banks, they make a lot of money by loaning to other banks because they charge this federal funds rate. But there's a risk involved. Of course, just like any other loan. What about if Bank of America loans money to some small commercial banks and that small commercial bank shuts down? Bank of America may lose its money. Okay? So now some banks are going to contemplate, just like me and you, if you have $20,000 in your savings account, that money is a lot safer than when you take it out and you try to invest it in some risky assets, maybe bonds or stocks or cryptocurrency. That's the same thing. And we know in finance is that if an asset is safe, then the interest rate on a safe asset is always lower than the interest rate on a risky asset. Okay, because loaning money by banks to to other banks is risky. The interest rate, if a bank chooses not to loan its money, that means they're keeping their money with the Fed, their excess reserves. That money is safe. While that is safe, they're not gonna be earning the interest rate that they should have earned. So that's the reason why the interest rate on reserves that the Federal Reserve pays banks when they leave their money with the Fed is always going to be lower than the interest rate that banks would earn if they loan those funds to other banks. So you see the logic. So that means by design, the discount rate, the interest rate on reserves, on reserve is less than the federal funds rate. And we have also shown that the federal funds rate is also less than the discount rate. Or you can write it the other way around. If you don't like the less than, you like more greater than, you can say the discount rate is always higher than the federal funds rate, but the federal funds rate is also higher than the interest rate on reserves. So these are the three types of interest rate that I'm going to be representing on the vertical axis of that graph. The price of money is interest rate, but there are three different interest rates. Okay, before I go any further, there's one thing I want to make here particularly clear here. why did the Federal Reserve start paying interest rate on reserves? I know this happened during the financial crisis of 2000, what? 2008. And I'm going to discuss here quickly why Ben Bernanke, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve, and his team found it necessary that they needed to start paying interest rate on these reserves, okay? So first of all, we know that excess reserves, if banks are keeping excess reserves, it has got a benefit. Banks that keep, the benefit of keeping excess reserve is that it acts as an insurance, acts as an insurance against deposit outflows. Outflows means withdrawals. So a bank that keeps a ton of excess reserve means that even if a wealthy customer like Warren Buffett type comes to your bank and withdraw large sums of money, you have enough money to pay for that withdrawal. You're not going to say, oh, we don't have liquidity. You can't tell a wealthy customer like that, oh, we don't have money today. That's not good customer service. So the benefit is that when you have the bank is holding a ton of excess reserves, they stand ready to pay any withdrawal from any customer who want to come and withdraw money at any given time. So they don't run the risk of having this liquidity problems. That's a benefit. The downside is that excess reserves don't earn you a lot of money. There's opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost, you guys learn in your principles of macro, the word opportunity cost is what you must give up if you make a choice to do something. So the opportunity cost of holding excess reserves is given like this. It is basically the interest rate that the bank should have earned had they loaned that money to other banks minus the interest rate that they earn on reserves anyway. So I want to explain this. So if a bank chooses to hold excess reserves, that is a good thing. That's a benefit, is that it acts as an insurance against deposit outflows, against the withdrawals from customers who want to withdraw. But the cost is that when you hold too much excess reserves, bank is losing money because the bank should have earned this interest rate if he had chosen to loan those excess reserves to other banks. Okay, let's say if this interest rate is 5%, and the excess interest rate on reserves, if the bank chooses to keep money with the Fed, it's always very small, like 1%. So the opportunity cost is going to be the 5% interest rate that the banks should have earned had they loaned that interest rate to other banks, minus what they're going to be earning when they leave that money as excess reserve with the Federal Reserve, which is 1%. So they're still going to lose 4%. That is the cost, opportunity cost. But I didn't get it. Then the other story I wanted to tell you, which is why did the Fed start to pay interest rate on reserves beginning the fall of 2008 during the aftermath of the financial crisis? The reason was that, remember I told you, you watched the videos, when the financial crisis hit, started from the housing market, many Wall Street banks were failing. So the Federal Reserve basically pursued these unconventional tools of monetary policy, like quantitative easing. They purchased a large sum of toxic assets from Wall Street banks. So banks had a lot of liquidity, and the fear was that because the Fed had intervened and injected a lot of liquidity to American banks to keep them strong again, the fear was that if these banks were to extend those loans to the non-bank public, to we, the members of the public and corporation, that would be inflationary. So to prevent banks from, let's say, all the money they received from the Fed bailout in 2008, from preventing that money going into the public, going into the economy to cause inflation, the Fed say, well, we are going to give you, we are bailing you out. We injected a lot of money into your liquidity, into American banks. But we're going to create an incentive. Instead of you going to loan that money out there to cause inflation, you could just keep part of that money with us. We're going to pay you interest rate. So the Fed created this incentive where instead of banks going to lend money to a risky economy, because it was risky during the financial crisis, most of them chose to keep that money actually with the Fed, where they earn some small fee, the interest rate on reserves. That kept inflation subdued in the 2008, 2009, 2010 period when we were experiencing the financial crisis. That's the reason why they started that. Okay. So now having introduced this interest rate, Let's now talk about the market itself, the demand and supply side of this market for reserves. Because when we talk about the market has got a demand side and a supply side. So let's talk about the market for reserves. This market has a demand side and it also has a supply side. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit about this. How we can talk about this a little bit. So let's start with the demand side of the market for reserves. Okay, so the demand is a little bit different from the normal demand curve that you have seen. It's going to be what we're going to be called, as those who were in class on Monday, we call it a king demand curve. That demand curve, okay, of course, the price of reserves, so this demand for reserves. You know, now when we draw the demand curve, price goes on this axis. The price of reserves, as I said at the beginning, is the interest rate. So, and then we're going to have quantity of reserves on this axis. Quantity goes on the horizontal axis. Quantity of reserves. You can just write that as what? You can write just as R. So the demand curve for reserves slopes downwards like that. Thought about my drawing. And then it becomes completely flat. We call it a king demand curve. So we're going to label this RD. RD standing for demand for reserves. The demand curve for reserves. Okay, so this minimum threshold, so this is the type of demand curve you've never seen. You guys are used to seeing just a downward, completely downward sloping demand curve. This demand curve is what we call a kink demand curve. Kink demand curve. In other words, it slopes downwards, then it reaches a point here, and then it becomes flat, completely perfectly elastic. So this flat portion of the demand curve, I'm going to explain, that establishes the minimum threshold on interest rate, and that interest rate is what we call the interest rate on reserves that we're talking about. This interest rate that the Federal Reserve pays banks when banks choose to what? To deposit their money with the Fed. Now, as I said earlier on, the federal funds rate, let's go back there, the federal funds rate is supposed to be greater than the what? The interest rate on reserves. So let's say from the law of demand, if this is the price of you must pay as a bank if you want to borrow reserves, which we call IFF. Let's say this is IFF1. From the law of demand, you draw a line and you hit the demand curve. That means the quantity demanded of reserves by banks that want to borrow would be RD1. And from a law of demand, when the price falls, meaning that if the interest rate on reserves falls, the federal funds rate, then banks, the quantity demanded of reserves is going to increase to RD2. Okay, so you're going to move along the what? Along this demand curve from point A to point B because interest rate is falling. So quantity demand is going to go up. Just imagine if interest rate continues to fall, the federal funds rate. Okay, then the quantity demanded of reserve continue to fall, to increase to R3. Okay, now let's pretend that suppose the federal funds rate falls and equals to the what? Let's say this IFF4. It falls now and equals to the interest rate that banks pay on reserves. What does that mean then for banks that want to borrow, or banks that want to lend reserves to other banks? So if let's say you're Citibank, you had a ton of excess reserve that you wanted to lend, and you see this happening, because if you lend money to other banks, you're going to be charging the IFF4. Let's say that interest rate now has fallen to 1%. The 1%, and the interest rate on reserve is also 1%. So that means banks would be indifferent between lending money to other banks and leaving the money accumulating reserves with the Fed because they get paid the same amount, if 1%. So that means if the federal funds rate were to fall and eventually equal to the interest rate that the Federal Reserve pays bank when banks keep their reserves with the Fed. American banks are going to be indifferent between loaning money to other banks or keeping it with the Fed. And to make matters even worse, think about a case where if the federal funds rate were to fall below, let's say you got IFF5, it has fallen now below this what? This interest rate on reserves. Then what do you think banks are going to do? Where do they make more money? If the interest rate that they lend money to other banks fall and is lower than the interest rate that they earn when they leave the money with the Fed, then banks are just going to accumulate their reserves with the Fed. See that? So that interest rate becomes redundant. So by the way, this King demand curve started in 2008 when the Fed started to pay interest rate on reserves. The demand for reserves used to be a complete downward sloping demand curve. The reason why the Fed started paying interest rate on reserves is that they wanted to set some minimum threshold on interest rates so that the federal funds rate could not fall below a certain threshold. They didn't want interest rates to become negative or hitting the zero. Because I told you the implication of it. Because if you have a completely downward sloping demand curve, let's say it was like that, then it's possible that the federal funds rate could fall and become negative. And we don't want negative interest rate. We saw that with the Japanese lost decade of the 90s. When interest rates become negative, what does that mean? That means you go to a bank, that's what happened in Japan in the 90s. That means you'd go to a bank, borrow 10,000 yen, you pay back 9,000 yen. You think any cent bank is going to loan you money at 10,000 yen where you have to pay back 9,000 yen? So we saw that with Japan. It happened in Japan. Interest rates became negative, and the Japanese banks refused to lend. And so corporations could not seek any loans. People in Japan could not seek any loan. And that translated into low economic growth, those negative economic growth. So when you hear economists talking about the Japanese lost decade of the 90s, they're talking about that idea that interest rates in Japan became negative, banks refused to lend, and then the economy of Japan stalled for the whole decade of the 90s. So the Fed did not want to replicate that mistake that the Japanese went through in the 90s. That's the reason why Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve in 2008, they set the minimum threshold on interest rate by establishing the interest rate on reserves. So when the demand curve becomes flat like this, means that the federal funds rate can no longer fall below that threshold. If it ever did, no bank would loan money to each other. Why? They would rather accumulate their reserves with the Fed because they would earn a somewhat higher interest rate. So that's how the demand for reserves look like. It's a little technical. Now let's talk about the supply side. So once I talk about the supply of reserves, then I'm going to talk about the equilibrium in the market for reserves. Then we're going to start talking about monetary policy. Okay, so let's talk about. Let me hop in a slide here and talk about it on the other side. Okay, so here we're going to talk about the supply for reserves. Okay. Okay, so now, when you talk about the supply, we want to talk about the total supply of reserves. Because remember, R stands for reserve. So let's talk right about it. Reserves notation is gonna be R. So what drives the reserves in a banking system? You already saw that in chapter 14. The Federal Reserve affects the supply of reserves in a banking system. We saw when the Fed buys $50 million worth of bonds, didn't we say in chapter 14 that bank reserves go up by $50 million? And if the Federal Reserve loans money to bank directly, that also affects reserves in the banking system. So the tools of monetary policy, the first two tools, the Fed's open market operation like buying and selling of securities and lending to financial institutions, will affect the supply of reserves in the banking system. So that means, because there are two ways, primary ways that the Federal Reserve can influence the size of reserves in the banking system and monetary base, we can decompose these total reserves into what we're going to be called, the part that can be controlled by open market operation, which we're going to be calling what? Non-borrow reserves, NBR, plus the part that is controlled by lending to banks, which is borrow reserves. Yes. Because there are two main tools of monetary policy that the Fed uses a lot. There are four of them, but the main ones are open market operation, which is a Federal Reserve buying and selling of treasury securities. We already established, when the Fed sells bonds to banks, the monetary base decreases, reserves will decrease as well. But if the Fed buys or conducts an open market purchase of treasury securities from banks, then the reserves in the banking system is going to go up and the monetary base will go up as well by the same amount. So that means when the Fed conducts open market operation, it affects the non-borrow reserve component of the reserve, right? And then when the Fed loans money to bank, this BR is what we are calling borrowed reserves. It's affected when the Fed is lending money to banks. When the Fed lends money to banks, borrowed reserves go up. And when the Fed buys or sells bonds, non-borrowed reserve is the one that is affected. We call this non-borrowed reserves. This is due to open market operation. This one is due to the Fed lending money to bank. But overall, each of those monetary policy tools, whether lending money to banks that affect borrowed reserves or buying or selling of treasury securities, whether any of those can be implemented will affect the total reserves in the banking system. So that means I can illustrate these two types of reserves to how they affect the supply of reserves into this supply curve. So let's talk about that supply curve for reserves. Just like we talk about the demand curve for reserves. So supply curve for reserves. So this supply curve also is not going to be like your typical supply curve that you always confronted with. We tend typically slope upwards. It's also going to be what we call a king supply curve. So, and again, when you're drawing any supply curve, just like in year 23, 15, 23, 14 class, the price goes on this axis, and as usual, again, the price of reserve is interest rate. And then here, quantity of reserves here, we can put just all, meaning quantity of reserves. So what I'm saying, the supply curve, let me draw it and explain it on the other side. This supply curve is vertical first, like that, and then it becomes flat. So this is a RS, which is going to be, we're calling this a supply curve for reserves. So I want you to follow me very well. So this flat section of what you see, this supply curve is what is vertical, then it becomes flat. It's perfectly inelastic up to a point, then it becomes completely perfectly elastic. So the flat portion of the supply curve here establishes the maximum threshold on interest rate. And that maximum threshold on interest rate is the discount rate. Okay? And then this vertical portion of the supply curve, when you read point here, when you're reading quantity, because remember we're saying that total reserves equals to non-borrow reserves, which can be influenced by open market operation, buying and selling of securities, and borrow reserves, which can be influenced by the Fed lending money to banks. So when you start from zero, from the origin up to this, where this line, the vertical line, hits the what? The horizontal axis. All these reserves is what we're going to be calling non-borrow reserves. Meaning that, any change. Okay, so then beyond this point, because beyond this point here, when you go beyond this point here, which is correspond to this flat portion, that's what we're going to be calling borrow reserves. Let me give an example. If let's say this is $60 billion, up to the vertical line, so that means non-borrow reserve in the banking system is $60 billion. So if I put a number here, like say this is 100 billion, there's 100 billion here. So you're going to see the gap, because from this length, 0 to the vertical line, 60 billion. So that extra, which is 40 billion, 60 to 100 billion, the difference is 40 billion. That would be borrow reserves. That's how you read it. So anything that corresponds to the flat portion of the supply curve is what we are calling borrow reserves. Anything that corresponds to the vertical portion, when you're reading from down here, is what we call non-borrow reserves. So now that's a supply of reserves in the banking system, consists of both non-borrow reserves and borrow reserves. So now let's talk about it a little bit. Let's pretend that the federal funds rate was IFF1. then all reserves in the banking system are what? Non-borrowed reserves. Let's say this thing increases to IFF2. Let's say the federal funds rate increases. Still, as long as the federal funds rate is below the discount rate, let me make that clear to you. Anytime the federal funds rate is below the discount rate, it means it's cheaper for banks that want to borrow from among each other. Because borrowing from among each other, you get charged a federal funds rate. That means borrowing from a Fed would be expensive. And banks would not borrow from a Fed. So that means borrow reserves would be zero. And that's the reason why all these reserves that exist is what we're calling non-borrow reserves. Because no bank is going to borrow from the Fed if there was a cheaper way they can borrow money from other banks at a lower interest rate. Okay, let's assume that this interest rate, the federal funds rate, continues to rise. Now, it's almost touching the discount rate. Still, as long as it's below the discount rate, banks are going to continue to borrow from among each other. Okay, now let's pretend that, eventually this interest rate rises and now equals to the what? Let's say this is a new IFF4. The IFF4 now is equal to the discount rate. Now that's interesting. That basically means that if the federal funds rate ever rises and equals to the discount rate, that means banks that want to borrow, they would be indifferent from borrowing from among each other, from other private banks, and from borrowing from the Federal Reserve, because you get charged the same interest rate, because the discount rate now equals to the what? To the federal funds rate. And by design, as I said in the beginning, because a central bank like the Federal Reserve plays a critical role as a lender of the last resort. That's one of the reasons why a central bank was created in the first place. I want you guys, during your free time, you go to that website where we normally download the data called the Federal Reserve Economic Data Bank, where you type Fred and you whatever. And then on the search menu, type discount rate. And you can ask for it by monthly frequency or daily or weekly or annual frequency. Download the data on the discount rate that the Federal Reserve has been charging banks, let's say for the last 20 years. And then go back and download the federal funds rate. You can type the federal funds and download the same frequency. You're going to see that at every point, the discount rate is always above the federal funds rate. It's always by design. Because any central bank that allows the federal funds rate to rise above the discount rate loses its critical role as a lender of the last resort. So I hope you guys are following. So by design, the federal funds rate is always below the discount rate. Okay, but let's pretend, just for the sake, for illustration, let's pretend that suppose the federal funds rate were to rise above the discount rate. What is the implication? That means if Bank of America wanted to borrow from another bank like Citibank, the interest rate that Citibank would charge Bank of America would be higher than the interest rate that the Federal Reserve wouldn't charge Citibank, would charge Bank of America. So then Bank of America would prefer borrowing from the Fed in that case. That's the reason why this thing becomes flat, because if federal funds rate equals the discount rate or federal funds rate rise above the discount rate, banks are going to choose to borrow from the Fed, where it's cheaper. So that's why this flat portion now represents borrow reserves. Once we have hit the ceiling on interest rate, banks always try to borrow from the Fed, because borrowing from the Fed and borrowing from other banks they would feel indifferent in terms of the cost, the interest cost. So in this case, the supply curve is vertical, then it becomes flat. Very interesting. Okay, so now what you can see from it, so the supply curve, because it's a king supply curve, establishes the maximum threshold on interest rate, that the federal funds rate can no longer rise above the discount rate. If it ever did, it becomes some sort of a redundant interest rate, because no bank would want to borrow from other banks at a higher federal funds rate when they could actually borrow from a Fed at a lower discount rate. So that means by design, it's not possible. Even though federal funds rate can rise above that, it would be redundant. It would just collapse back to below ID or equals to ID. So this is gonna establish like some upper threshold on interest rates. On the other hand, when you look at the demand side of the market that I described earlier, the interest rate on reserves establishes the minimum threshold on interest rate. that the federal funds rate cannot, by saying the minimum threshold, I'm basically emphasizing the fact that the federal funds rate cannot fall below that minimum threshold. If the federal funds rate were to fall below the interest rate on reserves, the implication would be that banks would choose not to lend among each other because it would be what? They would not make a lot of money. They would just choose to accumulate their reserves with the Fed, where they earn a somewhat higher interest rate on reserves. So that would also be a redundant, if the federal funds rate falls below IOR, it would be some kind of redundant interest rate because no bank is going to lend money to other banks when they are earning a lower interest rate. Instead, they would rather leave that money with the Fed where they earn a somewhat higher interest rate on reserves. So this also establishes the minimum. So the demand curve being kink and flat at this point, it establishes a minimum threshold on the federal funds rate, that the federal funds rate cannot fall below that minimum threshold. And by the supply curve having kink at that point, it establishes also the maximum threshold on interest rate, that the federal funds rate can no longer rise above that maximum threshold. So by so doing, the Fed is trying to minimize fluctuations in the what? In the interest rate, in the federal funds rate. Okay, so now let's put things now in what? In equilibrium. There you go. Because markets always reach equilibrium. So now you know that this is how the demand curve for reserves look like. It slopes downwards, then it becomes flat. And then this is how the supply curve looks like. It's vertical, then it becomes flat. Okay, but markets always go to equilibrium. Equilibrium means that quantity supply of reserves must equal to quantity demanded of reserves. So that means if I draw my demand curve, which is a king demand curve, see it slopes downwards, then it becomes flat. So the flat portion determines what? The interest rate on reserves. And then I draw my supply curve. And remember, from 0 up to this point, this is non-borrow reserves. We talk about that, right? See, so now the supply curve, which is this king supply curve, is intersecting the demand curve at point 1. Okay, so the point of intersection determines equilibrium what? Equilibrium federal funds rate, that IFF star. An equilibrium quantity of what? Non-borrow reserves in the banking system. So now let's discuss a little bit. This is a kind of supply and demand. Okay, so we know that when RS equals to RD, that is an equilibrium. But what about if the federal funds rate were to rise above the equilibrium, like say IFF2? What exceeds what? Is the market in equilibrium? No. At any interest rate which is above equilibrium, any interest rate above equilibrium creates an excess supply. There's going to be a surplus of reserves in the banking system. Why? Take IFF2. If you draw a line across this dotted line, this dashed line, when you draw that line from IFF2, you hit the demand curve first. You can read the quantity demanded down here, and then you continue, you're going to hit the supply here, meaning that supply exceeds demand by this much. When supply exceeds demand, that's what we call excess supply or surplus. There's a surplus of reserves in the banking system. And anytime there's a surplus of funds in the banking system, the price of the funds are going to fall. The price of reserves will fall. That's what we teach you in principles of macro and microeconomics. When supply exceeds demand, price tend to fall. The price of reserves here is the federal funds rate. That's a price banks must pay if they want to borrow from other banks. So in that case, since supply exceeds demand, that's going to put a downward pressure on price. See how we put an arrow going down? Interest rate will fall back to equilibrium. And the converse is true. If the federal funds rate were very low, let's say way below equilibrium, like IFF1, if you draw this dashed line across, you hit the supply curve first. Before you hit the demand curve. Meaning that at this interest rate, quantity supply is less than quantity demanded. When quantity demanded of reserves exceed quantity supply, that creates a shortage of funds, or what we call excess demand for reserves. And anytime there's a shortage of reserves in the banking system, that's going to put an upward pressure on price being the federal funds rate. So you can see that's why I drew an arrow pointing upwards, that the market eventually is going to go back to equilibrium. So this equilibrium becomes a stable equilibrium. In other words, if the markets were not in equilibrium, such as when we have IFF2 and IF1, the market forces of demand and supply will act as if to push the markets back to equilibrium. Okay? So that's what it is. So now that I put everything into context, you can see how the whatever. So I basically discussed those things here. When the federal funds rate is lower than also I talked about this already. The changes in market equilibrium and stuff like that. Okay. So now let's talk about how changes in the tools of monetary policy affect the federal funds rate. Because we teach you guys know that like about 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks before you guys broke for Thanksgiving, the Federal Reserve lowers this interest rate called the federal funds rate by 25 basis points. That's the interest rate that the market is always following, Wall Street. A lot of you are going to become investors out there or investment analysts working for corporations and banks. That is an interest rate that the market worships, that the market follows what the Fed is doing. When the Fed lowers interest rate or raises interest rate, stock market is going to respond to that. The bond market is going to respond to changes in the Federal Reserve interest rate policy. So now the question, and we know that now, but conceptually, when the Fed buys bonds, you already learned from chapter 14, that's going to lead to an increase in reserves in the banking system. The monetary base goes up and money supply goes up. And once money supply goes up, interest rate is going to fall. Okay, so let's see how the Fed, if the Fed buys bonds and lowers it, how that's going to affect the open market operation. Okay, so how it's going to affect the federal funds rate. So let me clear something here. Let me open a new slide and talk about it on the other side. So we're going to start discussing the tools of how changes in the tools of monetary policy affect the federal funds rate, which is this key interest rate that the Federal Reserve targets. So let's talk about tools of monetary policy. So here we're discussing how changes in the tools of monetary policy affect non-borrow reserves and interest rate. So let's say, suppose the Fed conducts an open market purchase. So I already told you that the quantity of reserves in the banking system consists of non-borrow reserves plus borrow reserves when I was discussing the supply portion. So we know from chapter 14, anytime the Fed buys bonds, let's say it's $50 billion bond purchase from banks. That means reserves in the banking system go up. But what reserve goes up is the non-borrow reserves, because the Fed is not lending money, they're buying securities. That means if the non-borrow reserves goes up, the overall quantity of reserves in the banking system is going to go up. So the supply of reserves is going to shift to the right. And the converse is true. When I say suppose the Fed sells bonds instead, okay? Again, you know that the supply of reserves in the banking system consists of non-borrow reserves and borrow reserves. So when they sell reserves, sell bonds, we made it very clear in chapter 14, that's going to decrease the reserves in the banking system. What reserve it decreases is the non-borrow reserves, which dragging down the overall reserves now. Okay, so now let's talk about it now. So we normally teach you that when the Fed buys bonds, the federal funds rate is going to decrease. Okay, when the Fed sells bond, I made some they want reserve. So yeah, that's right. When the Fed buys bonds, the federal funds rate is going to decrease because the borrow reserves in the banking system non-borrow reserve goes up. But that's going to depend on the position of the supply and demand. So let's talk about here. See, this was your initial equilibrium at point 1. This IFF1, where the demand and supply for reserve, you illustrate this as RS. Okay, so you can see the initial supply curve is the entire blue line, which is upwards, then it becomes flat. And then the demand curve is also this blue line that slopes downwards and becomes flat. So let's say the initial intersection between supply and demand was happening at the downward sloping portion of the demand curve. See that point one? It's happening on the downward sloping portion of the demand curve. It's not happening at the flat portion of the demand curve. In this case, buying bonds will affect the interest of federal funds rate. Because when you buy bonds, we know that now we already talked about it. Buying bonds is going to increase the supply of non-borrow reserves in the banking system. See? So non-borrow reserve is going to increase. See that? That means this line shifts to the right. So because the supply shifts to the right, make no mistake though, don't shift the flat portion of the supply curve. The flat portion of the supply curve shifts. That's another tool of monetary policy. That's the discount rate. So when the Fed is buying bonds and increasing the supply of reserves in the banking system, non-borrow reserves, it's only the vertical portion of the supply curve that shifts. The flat portion remains intact. You can see that the new demand curve, which is a red line, sorry, the new supply curve, which is a red line, is still vertical, but then the flat portion is the same as before. So the flat portion does not shift. But the new equilibrium now is going to be the point where the new supply curve intersects the demand curve, which is at point what? Point 2. So in this case, the equilibrium federal funds rate is going to fall. See, the federal funds rate, which is this interest rate that the Fed targets, is going to fall. And that's exactly what they did about 2.5 weeks ago. When they met and the Fed lowered the federal funds rate by 25 basis points. That's exactly what they did. They purchased bonds, treasury securities from a market that led to a decrease in the federal funds rate by 25 basis points. And let me tell you one thing. The Fed has got expert statisticians and economists who do this prediction. They know exactly how much bond purchase is needed to lower interest rate by say 25 basis points, by 0.25%, like they did like about 2.5 weeks ago. Okay, what about selling? What about if I say the Fed sold securities? If the Fed sells bonds, then the supply of the supply of bonds would fall. This thing will shift to the left inside. So it will shift like it will shift like that. If they were selling bonds, but then the flat portion will be like this. I didn't draw it very well, but the new equilibrium will be somewhere here. The vertical portion will shift to the left. Let me actually draw that. Okay, but before I do that, let's talk about this other case on the panel on the right. Here, remember I said that before the Federal Reserve conducted an open market purchase, the initial equilibrium between supply and demand was happening at the downward sloping portion of the demand curve. See point 1? That's a downward sloping portion of the demand curve. But what if the initial equilibrium was happening at the flat portion of the demand curve? See this point 1 here on the panel, the diagram on the right? That equilibrium where supply of reserve and demand for reserve are intersecting at point 1 is happening at the flat portion of the demand curve when the demand curve became kinked. So in this case, in the second case, when the Fed buys bonds, which shift the demand, so supply of reserves to the right, we end up at point 2. There's going to be no change on the what? On the federal funds rate. Why? Because when the initial equilibrium was happening at the flat portion of the demand curve, that means the federal funds rate, IFF1, was already equivalent to the interest rate on reserves. That's why when the Fed sets a minimum threshold on interest rate, no matter what you do with policy, can no longer lower interest rate below that minimum threshold. So buying bonds, in this second case, will have zero effect on what? On the federal funds rate. It will remain the same. IFF1 is going to be IFF2. Okay? So this was a case of what? Open market purchase. What about if the Fed was selling bonds instead? So let's look at that case. What about the case of, which I did not have it on the graph, that's I want us to draw, open market sale. Suppose the Fed was selling treasury bonds instead to all securities. So then we know that we know reserve, first of all, equals to non-borrow reserves plus borrow reserves. You know that. So when the Fed sells bonds, the quantity of non-borrow reserves is going to fall. So the overall quantity of reserves is going to fall. So in terms of the diagram, if we draw this, let's say this was your, I'm going to draw just one case, a case where it's possible to lower interest rate. So let's say this was my initial supply curve, RS1. And then this is your discount rate. Remember, the flat portion of the supply curve here established the discount rate on top there. This is your non-borrow reserve here. I can call this NBR1. And then I can draw the demand curve. Let's say this was my demand curve for reserves, which also becomes king. I call this RD. So this is my interest rate on reserve, I can call it, right? And then that means equilibrium federal funds rate, which is an IFF. So let's say the Fed that initially set a target here, and they want to change their target on interest rate, this IFF1. So if the Fed wants to increase the federal fund rate, they're going to sell bond. If they sell bond, we know that the quantity of non-borrow reserves is going to fall, meaning that the vertical portion of the supply curve is going to fall like this. It's going to shift to the left. Keep in mind, it's only the vertical portion that shifts. The flat portion is not going to shift. See that? Because the flat portion, that's another tool of monetary policy that's on discount rate. So in this case, when the Fed sells bond, shifting the supply curve or non-borrow reserves to the left, like that, non-borrow reserves, you can see that the new equilibrium federal funds rate is going to be the point where the new supply curve intersects the demand curve, which is this point here. So that means the federal funds rate target is going to shift upwards to IFF2. Equilibrium federal funds rate is going to increase. So when the Fed wants to increase the federal funds rate or interest rate, this interest rate that it controls, is going to sell reserves. So sell securities, conducts an open market sale of securities. Okay. All right, now let's discuss the second tool of monetary policy. So this was all about what? Open market operations. So the second tool of monetary policy, let me open another slide and kind of motivate it. The Fed sets a discount rate because the Fed lends money to banks by setting a discount rate, interest rate it charges banks. So the second policy is the discount rate. So we teach you in principles of macro that when the Fed lowers the discount rate, the Fed making it easier for banks to borrow money from the Fed. And if banks can easily borrow money, this cheap money from the Fed, the discount rate has been lowered. The logic is that when Bank of America borrows cheaply from the Federal Reserve, the Bank of America is going to be able to extend loans to we, the non-bank public, at a lower interest rate. Then money supply would go up. If the Federal Reserve wanted to decrease the money supply, they would jack up the interest rate. They would raise the discount rate, which is this interest rate they charge banks. So in other words, they're making it difficult for banks to access loans from the Federal Reserve. So if banks cannot access loans at a higher discount rate, that means it's unlikely that Bank of America was going to extend loans to we, the non-bank public, at a lower interest rate. So in that case, money supply is going to fall. But make no mistake, though, when we teach you like that, it's like automatic. That when the Fed lowers the discount rate, money supply goes up. When he raises the discount rate, interest rate goes. Sorry, money supply goes down. It doesn't work like that. So remember, banks have an option. Banks can borrow from a Fed and can borrow among each other. So if the Fed lowers the discount rate, let's say from 6% to 4%, but let's say the federal funds rate, which is this interest rate banks borrow from among each other, with 3%. Then lowering the interest rate from 6% to 4%, borrowing from a Fed at 4% is still more expensive than banks borrowing from among each other. So that is not going to influence the equilibrium federal funds rate. The only way the federal funds rate is going to be affected is when, let's say the federal funds rate was already equal to the what? To the discount rate. Then lowering that the federal, or if they want it to have an impact, is to make the discount rate be below the federal funds rate, which is something the Fed is not going to do in actual practice. So here's the case that I'm talking about. I was saying, let's say this was the initial equilibrium between, this is a demand for reserves, and then this is the initial supply, which is the entire blue vertical and the flat portion, that's your supply curve. So the equilibrium is at 0.1. Here's the initial federal funds rate. And then the discount rate was here. See, because I said the flat portion establishes a discount rate. So in this case, when the Fed chooses to lowering the discount rate means you shift the flat portion of the supply curve downwards. You don't shift the vertical, because the vertical portion is a what? It's open market operation that can shift the vertical portion. The flat portion is shifted when you change the discount rate. See, when you shift this flat portion downwards, like I've done here, this like the same thing as lowering the discount rate from ID1 to ID2. If you put numbers there, let's say banks were, because this is the interest rate that banks borrow from each other. Let's say this was 3%. And let's say this initial ID1 was 6%. That's the interest that the Fed was charging banks. And the Fed lowers it to 4%. That's what I'm saying. So if you lower it just by a little bit like this, as long as the new discount rate is still above the federal funds rate, then this equilibrium is not going to be affected. Banks will continue to borrow from among each other. So in this case, lowering the discount rate would have no effect on the equilibrium federal funds rate. If you want the Federal Reserve discount policy to affect the federal funds rate, is to assume that the initial equilibrium between supply and demand happened at the flat portion of the supply curve. See at point 1. Here it was happening at the at the vertical portion of the supply curve. If the initial equilibrium between supply and demand for reserves happened at the flat portion of the supply curve, meaning that the discount rate and the federal funds rate were already the same. Then lowering the discount rate, you lower the flat portion, will also lower the equilibrium federal funds rate. That's the point. That's a case where the lowering the discount rate will also decrease the federal funds rate. Okay, and the converse is true. And then the third tool of monetary policy that we always teach you guys is the reserve requirement ratio. The Fed sets a required, they might say, let's R is 10%. So suppose the Fed surprises bank and raises this reserve requirement ratio to 20%. So if the Fed increases the required reserve, that means the Fed is telling the American banks that they need now to keep a larger proportion of customer deposit as required reserves. 20% of deposit must not be loaned out. This change in policy may catch some banks by what? By surprise. Think about if a bank was only keeping 10% before as what? Required reserves. And the Fed now come and say, okay, it's 20. That some banks may not have enough liquidity to adjust to that. Doesn't mean the banks are broke. So if the Fed raises the minimum reserve requirement, that's going to increase the demand for reserves in the banking system. Some banks that may not have who are not keeping up with the minimum reserve requirement are going to start demanding reserves from other banks. So raising the minimum reserve requirement is going to shift the demand curve for reserves to the right. See? To the red line shifting to the right. And make no mistake though, remember the entire demand curve is a kink demand curve. See, it slopes downwards and then it becomes kink. At this point, it becomes flat. So when I'm saying shifting the demand for reserves to the right, it's only the downward sloping portion of the demand curve that is shifting. See? The flat portion is another monetary policy tool because the flat portion establishes the what? The interest rate on reserve. I talked about that earlier. So if you want to change the flat portion, shift the flat portion upwards or downwards, that means the Fed would be lowering the interest rate on reserves or increasing the what? The interest rate on reserves. That's the only thing that will shift this. I'm going to talk about it shortly. So let's say, suppose the Fed raises the minimum reserve requirement, catches some banks by surprise. That means the demand for reserves, only the downward sloping portion is going to shift to the right. So the new equilibrium is going to move from point 1 to point 2. So the equilibrium federal funds rate increases from IFF1 to IFF2. And the converse is true. If the Fed wanted to lower the federal funds rate using the discount window, the reserve requirement ratio, they may lower the reserve requirement. If they lower the reserve requirement, that means the demand for reserves would fall. It would shift to the left, something like this. So would be somewhere here. Federal funds rate equilibrium would fall. Okay. And then the last conventional tool of monetary policy is this new tool that I told you the Fed started implementing in what? In 2008, the fall of 2008, in paying interest rate on reserves. So how does the Fed change that policy? The change in that policy may or may not affect the what? The equilibrium federal funds rate. It depends on the initial equilibrium between supply and demand for reserves. For example, here, if the initial demand for supply and reserves, okay, happen at the what? At the downward sloping portion of the demand curve, then raising the what? If the Fed just raises the interest rate on reserve, raising the interest rate on reserve means shifting the flat portion of the demand curve upwards to here. That has got no effect on the equilibrium federal funds rate because the equilibrium is still up there at 0.1. We will have no effect. But look at the second case here. If the initial equilibrium between supply and demand for reserves was happening at the flat portion of the demand curve, see 0.1 is different from 0.1 here. On the left, the diagram on the left, 0.1 is happening at the what? At the downward sloping portion of the demand curve. The diagram on the right, initial equilibrium is happening at the flat portion of the demand curve. If the equilibrium is happening at the flat portion of the demand curve, that means the initial federal funds rate, equilibrium federal funds rate, and the interest rate on reserves were already the same. They're equal. So raising the what? Raising the interest rate on reserves by shifting the flat portion of the demand curve upwards will also influence the equilibrium federal funds rate. So IFF2 IF also shifts upwards. We go to 0.2. Okay. So that's what I want to talk about. Those are the conventional tools of monetary policy that I wanted to talk about. Now, what I'm going to be doing next, since now you know those conventional tools of monetary policy, and now we can use supply and demand now to basically investigate when the Fed changes each of those tools of monetary policy, how it may or may not affect the interest rate, this federal funds rate that the Fed always controls, that the market is always watching. Now you know you can now illustrate this using diagram, using what I call geometry. Okay? So up to this point, you should appreciate that at least now I've labored and showed you guys 3 different ways of which you can show how money changes in monetary policy by the Fed is going to affect the what? The money supply and interest rate. The first one is using the what? The balance sheet. When we say the Fed buys bonds, you know how to enter that in the balance sheet. The second one, we talked about using this equation, the model for money supply, where we derive the money multiplier. So you can actually calculate precisely how much money supply is going to increase when the Fed buys bonds. We did that already in chapter 14. And then the third case is using the graph, supply and demand. How does buying bonds affect reserves using a graph and affect, the federal funds rate? Okay. So now what we're going to do next, I'm going to talk about the advantages or the limitation of using each of those tools of monetary policy. Okay. But before I talked about that, I want to talk about how Federal Reserve's operating procedures limit fluctuation in the federal funds rate. Because now think about this. When the Fed establishes a minimum threshold on interest rate by setting this interest rate on reserves, that means the federal funds rate cannot fall below this point. And when the Fed makes the supply curve flat at this point, that means they're establishing the what? A maximum threshold on interest rate. The federal funds rate cannot rise above the discount rate. So by so doing that, the Fed is minimizing fluctuation in what? In interest rate. Let's look at this example, what I mean by this. How the Federal Reserve's operating procedures limit fluctuations in the federal funds rate. So let's say if the Fed was targeting the interest rate at IFFT, where the initial equilibrium between the supply curve and the demand curve happening at this point. And then the Fed starts to increase, let's say the demand for reserves start going up. Banks start to crave for reserves. If the demand for reserve goes up, we shift this to right. Okay, once you shift the demand curve, you see, immediately the new demand curve hits the flat portion of the supply curve. And it means that further increases in demand if you continue shifting this curve to the right, it will no longer increase the what? The federal funds rate. We have now reached the maximum threshold on interest rate. By so doing that, the Fed is limiting extreme fluctuation in the federal funds rate. That the federal funds rate, no matter how you shift the demand curve to the right, once we hit the flat portion of the supply curve, further shift of the demand curve to the right will have zero effect on the what? on the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate has already reached its maximum ceiling. So the federal funds rate cannot rise above the discount rate. So the Fed would be what? Minimizing the upstream on what? On interest rate. What about the downstream? What about if the demand curve were to shift downwards for the continue shifting downwards? If you continue shifting this demand curve, immediately we hit the what? We hit the flat portion of the supply curve, sort of the demand curve. Further shift of the demand curve to the left will not change the interest rate. Federal funds rate has really hit its minimum threshold. So by the Federal Reserve setting both the upper threshold, the discount rate, and the lower threshold on interest rate, is based literally minimizing fluctuation in what? In interest rate, in the federal funds rate. So let's talk about the conventional tools of monetary policy that we just talked about. So during normal times, the Federal Reserve has always used what? The three tools of monetary policy, which I discussed already: open market operation, discount lending, and reserve requirements to control the money supply and interest rate. And these are referred to as conventional, because conventional in the sense that those are the tools that the Fed has always used to control the supply of dollars and interest rate in the US economy. Okay? But the question is, how does the Federal Reserve actually operate those policy tools? Okay, as I told you at the very beginning, the open market operation is one of the most powerful conventional tools of monetary policy. The Federal Reserve deploys it about 96, 97% of the time. It's like the Fed's most favorite tool. Like, I told you about my story. In my house, if something breaks down, like a chain comes out of my bike, my most important tool that I know how to use, that I reach out to, is the what? Is a plier. If the problem in my house, I cannot fix it with a plier, that means it's beyond my pay grade. I gotta call somebody to what? To come and fix it for me. It's kind of similar. So the Fed's preferred tool is their plier. Their plier is open market operation. So let's talk about how the two types of open market operation, and then we're going to talk about how the open market operation is actually implemented. It's very easy the way they implement it. It's more like a click of the mouse. Okay. So, but before I talk about that, and you can skip inside the thread there, I'm going to talk about, first of all, there's a difference between a dynamic open market operations and a defensive open market operation. Let's talk about what that means. Okay. I'm going to start with a dynamic. There are two types of what? Open market operation, dynamic open market operation, and what? Defensive. I'm going to start discussing what dynamic means and what defensive means. So dynamic open market operations. So when the Fed, okay, when the Fed sets an IFF target, a federal funds rate target, let's say they want the Federal Reserve, you know, the Fed influences that federal funds rate, okay, at like say 2%. And let's say that the target has always been at 2% for say the last 4 or 5 years. But then something happened, but the Fed thinks that maybe it's about time to start lowering or increasing interest rate, because they see that maybe there are fears of inflation. Well, because when there are fears of inflation, the Fed is going to raise the federal funds rate. You know that, like they've been doing like in the last couple of summers. The last summer they raised interest rate a lot because they wanted to get a handle on inflation. So when the Fed starts to start changing its interest rate policy, because they fear that something bad may happen in the economy, it could be inflation, it could be recession, then we say, okay, now suppose the Fed begins to change this interest rate due to either fears of inflation, or recession. Then this is what? Then that's what we call dynamic what? Dynamic open market operation. The Fed, they had some interest rate which they were targeting at 2%, then they think it's about time maybe they raise it to 2.5 or they lower it to 1.5, whatever it is. Like they've recently decided to dynamically lower the what? The federal funds rate because they feel like maybe labor market conditions might not be getting tightened a little bit. So here's what I'm talking about here. So in terms of the diagram, to illustrate the dynamic market open market operation, let me show you here. So let's say the Fed. Let me draw this quickly and explain it. So this is dynamic open market operation. So we know we put interest rate here on this axis. We put quantity of reserves here. So let's say this was I'm sorry, my lines are crooked. So this is RS1, and then this is your non-borrow reserve here, 1. And then this was my initial demand curve for reserves, RD. You notice this flat portion establishes the interest rate on reserves. This is so let's say the Fed has set a target here, IFFT. Let's say this was 2%. We know that this flat portion on the supply curve established the discount rate. Okay, so here was the initial equilibrium. So the Fed had set a target of 2% on federal funds rate for a while. Now, then they start fearing that maybe the economy might be slowing down. If they think the economy may be slowing down, the Fed thinks maybe it's about time to lower interest rate. They've done that recently, the last 2 meetings. Before you left for Thanksgiving, they lowered interest rate by 25 basis points. So how do they lower interest rate again? You've learned that. So when the Fed decides to buy bonds to dynamically lower the interest rate, let's say they want to lower it by 50 basis points to like 1.5%. Then this is what I'm calling a dynamic market or open market operation. If the Fed wants to dynamically increase interest rate, maybe they think that there are fears of inflation, they will do that too. They will sell bonds instead of buy. Then this thing will shift to the left. So that you end up with a higher target on interest rate. Maybe that could be 2.5% if they want to raise interest rate by 50 basis points. So that's what dynamic open market operation is. When the Fed was was operating some federal funds rate target, but then they decide that it's about time to lower interest rate because they think there are fears that a recession might be coming to the economy, or they think it's about time to raise interest rate because they want to put a handle on inflation. Then that's what they call a dynamic. They're dynamically changing policy. Okay, the other open market operation policy is what we call defensive. So with defensive, you can even hear how the words sound, defensive. The Fed is trying to defend its interest rate policy. Defensive open market operation. Okay, so let's say, suppose the Fed wants the target on interest rate at 2%. If demand conditions force the federal funds rate, the interest rate, to rise or fall below this target, the Fed will restore the target interest rate at 2%. Then that is what we call a defensive. So let me show you how that different. So that means Okay, so here something might have happened on the demand for reserves. Maybe banks are craving for reserves. That put an upward pressure on what? On the federal funds rate. But the Fed doesn't want that interest rate to change. So they're going to defend the interest, their target on interest rate. So let's say this was your quantity of reserves here. This is interest rate on this axis. So let's say this is my initial demand, which determines what? This interest rate on reserves. And then this is my initial what? Supply. S1. This is discount rate here. Let's say let's say the Fed has set its target, which is this equilibrium. Federal funds rate target to be at 2%. And then all of a sudden, what I'm saying here is that banks start to crave for reserves. So if the demand for reserve increases, because this is not the Fed doing it, banks are the ones demanding, for whatever reason there may be, banks in America wanted to start demanding reserves from among each other, borrowing. That's going to put an upward pressure on the federal funds rate. So the federal funds rate is going to rise above the Fed's target to, like, say, 2.7%. But the Fed doesn't like that. The Fed wants the target to be at 2%. Then the Federal Reserve is going to counter this change in demand and to bring interest rate back to its target. So how should the Fed bring interest rate from 2.7% when the demand forces it to rise to 2.7%? What the Fed needs to do, the Fed is going to conduct what we call a defensive open market purchase. So remember, this is your initial NBR1. So the Fed is going to buy bonds. See that? They're going to shift this curve to right so that the new equilibrium is going to be where the new supply curve, which is this the new line, you see, intersect the new demand curve at this point. So there, the Fed would have defended its interest rate at 2%. So the quantity of non-borrow reserve is going to increase in that case to NBR2. That's what a defensive is. Something happened first that triggered a demand for reserve, then the Fed is going to use this what? So this in this example this is what we call a defensive open market purchase. Because for the Federal Reserve to defend its target on interest rate, it has to buy bonds to counter the initial increase in the demand. What about if the demand for reserves had fallen? Meaning that it would force the equilibrium federal funds rate to fall to say like 1.3, 1.2%. Then in that case, the Fed would use what we call a defensive open market sale. It will sell securities to bring interest rate back to what? To its target of 2%. So this curve will shift to the left instead. Following a shift of the demand curve to the left, the Fed will shift the supply for reserves to the left to keep interest rate at its target of 2%. So that's the distinction between dynamic market operation, open market operation, and what defensive open market operations. Okay, so now having said that, so now you know what that is. You know what these guys are. Let's talk about how the Fed actually implement open market operation. When we say the Fed buys $50 million worth of treasury bonds from banks, how does it work? It's an automated system. Okay, so all these banks you're seeing on Wall Street, especially the big banks like a Bank of America, they have their primary dealers. Dealers who are acting on behalf of Bank of America. So somebody's employed with Bank of America on Wall Street. Their job is just to wake up every morning and watch what the Fed is doing. If the Fed says the Fed is selling $100 billion worth of treasury bonds to banks, that primary dealer for Bank of America is going to convince Bank of America to buy part of that $100 billion of securities from the Fed. And do you know how that's this complaint? You know, I buy bonds in developing countries, like in my home country. The technology is still very very rudimentary. Where, you know, it's a bidding process. If the central bank is selling you something, you actually have to go and bid for it, and then they select the best bidders. It's a bidding process. Here's also the bidding process, but it happens on this automated system, a computer system called TRAP system, which stands for the Trading Room automated processing system. So let me describe how it works. So the Fed wants to sell $100 billion worth of treasury bonds to banks in America. Then the Fed is going to flag, because all these banks they are connected to this trap system through their dealers. Okay? So that information flashes on the screen. Oh, the Fed wants to buy $100 billion worth of securities from bank today. And then the Bank of America, Citibank, whatever banks out there, Wells Fargo, through their dealers, they're going to put in their bids. Okay, now this is how much we want to pay for those securities. Some banks are going to put how much. Then the Fed is going to select the best bids. And then it flashes the information back on the screen whose bids have been selected, who have been given a go-ahead to buy those securities from the Fed. And the process is complete. It's like within an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. So that's how the process works. And sometimes if the Fed wants to buy, they're going to put that flash that on the screen. Then banks are going to say, okay, we are willing to sell you this. Then the system selects the best bids. Which banks have the best bids? Okay. So there's also what we call a repurchase agreement. A repurchase agreement is the idea that if the Federal Reserve wants the effect of monetary policy to be short-lived, because we know when the Fed sells or buys bonds, it affects the money supply and it can affect the economy because interest rate would fall or rise. So sometimes the Fed doesn't want the effect of monetary policy to be long-lived on the economy. They want it to be short-lived. Okay? They don't want the impact to be felt for a long period of time. So what they would do, they can enter into an agreement with a bank that they're going to sell, like say, $100 million or $100 billion of securities to banks, with the agreement that they're going to buy it back. They're going to repurchase those securities back maybe within 6 months. And that's what we call a repurchase agreement. So the Federal Reserve enters into an agreement with banks across America that they're going to temporarily sell them the Federal Reserve securities worth $100 billion with the agreement that the Fed is going to repurchase it back within 6 months. So that the impact on monetary policy on the economy is short-lived. The opposite of the repurchase agreement is a March sale purchase agreement. A March sale purchase agreement is the Fed is going to purchase, enters into an agreement with banks across America that the Fed want to purchase $100 billion of securities with the agreement that the Fed is going to sell it back to them within a short period of time. That's a March sale purchase agreement. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about so that was open market operation. The Fed loves open market operation because it's easier to implement. What about the discount policy and the lend of the last resort? So the discount, we said the Federal Reserve is the lend of the last resort. Okay. So here's there are 3 types of credit that the Federal Reserve can extend to banks. Okay. Not all banks in America have got the same credit rating. Remember that. Just like me and you, when we go borrow money from our banks, some of us are going to get loans at a lower interest rate than others based on your credit scores. That's going to be the same with banks. Banks in America also have credit ratings. So if they go borrow from a Fed, even though sometimes for the matter of convenience we say, oh, maybe the discount rate is 5%, it's not 5% for all banks. Some banks may actually be borrowed at 3.5, 5%, something like that. Okay, so the banks who are in banks which are in sound financial standing or have got the high credit ratings always borrowed at what we call a Lombard facility, borrowed at a lower interest rate than banks that have relatively what? Lower credit ratings. So in other words, banks that are borrowing from accessing the Federal Reserve loans in the primary credit market, those are banks in sound what? Sound financial standing. They may access those loans at a 50 discount rate, which is 50 basis points less than all other banks that may not have sound credit ratings. We call the term the Lombard facility. If this comes from there's a city. If any of you go to Europe, you go to Italy. There's one of the Italian cities in northern Italy called what? The city of Lombardy. Lombardy is a city where in the Middle Ages, most of the banks in Italy were highly concentrated in that northern Italian city called the city of Lombardy. So people believe that during the Middle Ages, if you live closer to the city of Lombardy, you had easy access to credit than somebody who might be living in Milan or in Rome or other, or maybe in Florentina or some other some far away locations from banks. Okay, so we just coined the word Lombard's facility, that banks in America in sound credit rating have easy access to the Fed's discount loans. They're able to borrow at a lower discount rate at the Lombard facility, coined after that city of Lombardy, where there used to be heavy concentration of banking in northern Italy in the Middle Ages. Okay, but the idea is that the primary credit market is a market where banks which are in sound financial standing can access discount loans from a Fed at a relatively lower discount rate. Typically, it's about 50 basis points less than other banks that may not be in sound credit standing with the Fed. And then the banks which are not in relatively lousy credit with lousy credit ratings, they're going to access the Fed's loan in the secondary market, or we call it the secondary credit market. This is another market which is called credit, but the Fed has stopped this. But there used to be what they call seasonal credit, where the Federal Reserve would target specific industries in America which they think can help boost economic growth. So, like for example, if they think that manufacturing is a bedrock of the U.S. economy, and they want to boost manufacturing jobs in America, the Fed may lend money to banks in America and instructing those banks to specifically target those industries where there may be the seasonal activity, like for example, construction. We know there are peak and off-peak season. Skiing, for example, there are season that way people do skiing in the winter time. So if the Fed wants to boost resort activities in skiing, they may extend credit to banks in America and instruct those banks to specifically target those seasonal activities, which can help the economy in the short run. We call it the seasonal credit market. So the Fed, on the one hand, the Fed does prevent financial panics because the Fed is the land of the last resort. If you don't think about it, if you don't have a central bank like a Federal Reserve and banks start failing, banks cannot access, let's say in a crazy banking crisis where banks are all in having shortage of liquidity, they cannot borrow among each other. That means most banks would fail because if there's no Fed, the Fed is there to act as a cushion. It cannot help to give that loan to the banks as a last resort when banks cannot access loans anywhere. So that helps to prevent financial panics or financial crisis, banking crisis. The downside with the side is that it can create a moral hazard problem. That banks in America will always tend to screw up anyway because they know the Fed is always there to bail them out. So banks don't do the right thing because they know, if we fail anyway, we'll always go to the Fed. So that's a moral hazard component of the Federal Reserve acting as a lender of the last resort. On the one hand, the benefit is that it prevents financial crisis, but the downside is that it could be a moral hazard when banks in America tend to start screwing up all the time with the knowledge that, anytime they screw up, the Fed is always going to stand ready to bail them out. That becomes a moral hazard on the part of banks. All right, so I'm going to skip. These are some of the things you can read on your own. The other tool of monetary policy is the reserve requirement ratio. So the Depository Institution of the Monetary Contract 1980 sets the reserve requirement the same for deposit for banks. Okay, reserve requirements are equal to 0 for the first 15.5 million of a bank's checkable deposits. As I said, even though when we're giving you a test, we only set one number. As I just asked you the reserve requirement, if the reserve requirement ratio is 10%, calculate blah, 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 calculate the money multiplier. But there's not a one number for the reserve requirement ratio. They are varied based on the size of the bank's checkable deposit. For smaller banks, like very small credit unions in your hometown, which have only the smallest checkable deposit in a bank of only $15.5 million, those banks they are not supposed to keep any minimum reserve requirement. So as the size of the deposit rises, let's say from 15.5 to $115.1 million, then the Fed always what? Make those banks have to keep 3%. And 10% on checkable deposit, which are over $115.5 million. But the Fed has always they can vary the 10% requirement between 8 and 14%, depending on the state of the economy. If they want to stimulate the economy or they want to kind of tighten monetary policy. And I told you the interest rate on excess reserves, the Fed started paying interest rate on excess reserves starting the fall of 2008. I told you this is a new conventional tools of monetary policy. I already talked about that. I don't want to repeat that. So here's some of the relative advantages of different, more conventional monetary policy. Open market operations are the dominant policy, as I told you. The Fed uses this policy most of the time because the Federal Reserve has got complete control over the volume of transactions. The discount rate is less well used because it's no longer binding for most banks. Okay? But it can be used when banks are faced with severe liquidity problems. It can be deployed. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about here is that, which something that I hinted on already the other time. In 2007, 2008, the financial crisis and the Great American Recession, which that crisis had its roots in the what? In the U.S. housing market. We talked about it. You watched the video in chapter 9. Okay, it happened at a time when the Great American Recession happened in 2008, following the financial crisis. Interest rates in America were almost close to zero. So that creates an interesting problem for the Federal Reserve, something that the Fed never faced before. Because think about it, what should the Federal Reserve do on interest rate policy if the economy goes in a recession? We teach you over and over and say that the Fed must always lower interest rates to keep the economy strong when there are fears of a recession. Now, the problem is, if the recession is hitting the economy when the interest rates are already close to zero, how low can the Fed lower interest rate? How low can they go? Can they lower interest rates and make them negative? Of course, the answer is no. Okay, so that creates an interesting challenge for conventional monetary policy tools when the recession is happening at a time when interest rates are already near zero. Because the Federal Reserve tries to avoid what happens, what I told you, the Japanese lost decade of the 90s. You don't want to lower interest rate. That's what we call a liquidity trap in economics. When you lower interest rate and you make them negative. When you make interest rate negative, first of all, it discourages savings. How can you save money at a negative interest rate? It encourages borrowing, but at the same time, banks will not lend money at negative interest rate. So that would be the fall of the economy. Big fall in the economy, almost the collapse of the economy. Because if interest rates become negative, banks all are going to refuse to lend. This notion that you're going to borrow $10,000 from an American bank and you must pay back $9,000 does not work anywhere. The Japanese tried it, and that led to the collapse, almost the total collapse of the Japanese economy in the 90s. That's why you hear when economists talking about the Japanese lost decade of the 90s, they're basically talking about a time when interest rates in Japan became negative. The Bank of Japan lowered interest rate to keep the Japanese economy strong, and interest rates became negative, and banks in Japan refused to lend. So the Japanese economy fell. So for the 10 years of the 90s, the Japanese economy stalled and they never experienced any economic growth. So we learned from that movie already. So the Federal Reserve was trying to avoid the repeat of the Japanese experience of the 90s happening here in America. Okay, so that means the 2007-2008 financial crisis that led to the Great American Recession at that time was an interesting time for the U.S. economy and a big test for the Federal Reserve monetary policy, that the conventional tools of monetary policy that always strived to lower the federal funds rate would not work because interest rates were already very low. They were near what they call near their lower zero bound. See, they're near zero lower bound problem. You couldn't make them negative. You couldn't. Okay, so that means the Federal Reserve had to come up with things that were never tried before. So instead of the Federal Reserve going to their most trusted policy, conventional policy of buying bonds when the economy was weak in 2008, they could not do that because buying bonds would mean you would lower interest rate and make interest rate negative because they were already very low. The recession happened at a time when the interest rate were already near zero. That means buying bonds was not an option. So the Federal Reserve had to start some policy, what we call non-conventional policy tools during that financial crisis, things that were never tried before. And the most important tool, there were several of them, like the term auction facility. They opened up new lending programs for banks because banks were in financial crisis. They expanded their discount window policy, lending policy. But the other thing that they did, which were never tried before, were this large asset purchase from Wall Street. Because remember, the main source of the financial crisis of 2008 was that US banks screwed up. They started these mortgage-backed securities, and they lent out money in housing. When the housing market fell and Americans defaulted on their mortgage loans, those mortgage-backed securities, the values of those mortgage-backed securities that the banks were holding on their balance sheet became worthless. So the banks were basically holding onto a bunch of useless assets, toxic assets on their balance sheet. So to shore up liquidity in American banks, the Federal Reserve went and bought some of those toxic assets, those mortgage-backed securities from the market, from Wall Street banks. That's what we call quantitative easing, this large-scale asset purchase by the Federal Reserve. They had several rounds of it, QE1, QE2, and look at the impact of it on what? On reserves. Because when they bought those assets from it, anytime the Fed buys something from banks, remember the immediate impact is that reserves are going to go up and the monetary base goes up. Look at from 2007, the size of reserves in the banking system, these numbers are in trillions of dollars, was a little bit under $1 trillion. But ever since the Fed has been purchasing those toxic assets, the size of reserves in a US banking system, but in contemporary times, has risen almost close to $7 trillion. So that tells you the scale of the intervention that the Fed had on Wall Street banks. So you can read about some of those. And then the other thing that the Federal Reserve started was a forward guidance policy. Forward guidance idea that the Fed made it clear to Wall Street that they were going to operate a low interest rate policy for a long period of time. That lasted for nearly 10 years. The Federal Reserve in its history has never told the market what they were going to do. That was the only time when the Fed would actually communicate to the what? To the market, telling the market that, so that the market, a US market and global market could be, to provide some kind of stability. Because if market participants on Wall Street knew that the Fed was gonna keep its low interest rate policy for a long period of time, then that brings stability in the market. That's what they did, forward guidance. And never before in the history of the Federal Reserve, before 2007, had the Fed communicated to the market what they were going to do. But they changed that in 2007, 2008. They started communicating that they were going to keeping the federal funds rate at near zero for an extended period of time. They did that for nearly 10 years. So we talked about that. So this, if you want to talk about some of the intervention during the financial crisis, which you already watched in the video of chapter 9, you can read some more here. But anyway, I talked about the last part. I want to show you guys what happened. What is the monetary policy tools of the European Central Bank? The European Central Bank they also conduct open market operation, like they buy and sell securities in Europe. Okay, and they have what they call the main financing operation. People, you can refinance it. Okay, those securities. Okay, and then they have longer term refinancing operation, and then they also lending to banks. They do lending to banks, marginal lending facility, marginal lending rates, just like the Federal Reserve lends money to banks here. Reserve requirement, 2% of total amount of checkable deposit and other short-term deposits. So they set a relatively lower reserve requirement I mean the policy of the ECB. The reserve requirement for the Federal Reserve is relatively higher compared to what we see in the ECB. They pay interest on those deposits, so cost of complying is very low. So the Fed also the ECB also pays what? They pay interest rate on bank deposit. Okay. So that kind of concludes my discussion of this chapter. So I'm gonna wish you guys again a happy Thanksgiving. And by the way, I just recorded this on Thanksgiving Day because I love to work on Thanksgiving. So I'm gonna convert this recording into a permanent YouTube link, and I'm gonna upload it at Canvas. So make sure you watch this video perhaps before our Monday class, because I'm not gonna go over this again. We're gonna do chapter 16, or if I'm going through it, I'm just gonna, have a quick review, but hopefully let you watch the video already ahead of time. Again, thank you so much, and I see you guys on Monday, in class. Bye-bye.